Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Family History Show with Find My Past. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is going to be our special live broadcast to mark Remembrance Day, which took place on Tuesday, and of course Remembrance Sunday, which was the Sunday just gone. My name is Ellie. I am the content manager here at Find My Past, and alongside me today we also have our research specialist, Jen Baldwin. How are you doing, Jen?
I'm good. Ellie, how are you?
I'm cold. It's very wet and rainy here in Wales. What is new?
I won't talk about Colorado weather then.
Yeah, it's just that time of year, I guess, for those of us in this hemisphere. Jen is a genealogist and, as I said, our research specialist here at Findmypast, and she's here to help you guys out a bit today, I guess, as we bring the stories of our wartime ancestors more into closer focus. So yeah, I hope we've got a couple of people joining us live. I can see some live comments coming in, which is great. How are you doing, everybody? Lovely to see you. We've not done one of these together in a while, Jen, have we? I don't think.
Yeah, it has been a while, actually. I've done a couple with Liam recently, but I feel like you and I have not been on together for quite some time.
Yeah, it's always nice when we get to have an at it together. I know, like I miss this. Like we should do this more often. Wonderful. Today we are going to be talking about remembrance and some of the research that Jen has done for our remembrance campaign this year. We'll get into that in a little bit, but what I'm hoping is that we'll talk a little bit about your methodology, Jen, and a case study. And I'm hoping it's going to be really, really useful for anybody watching, anybody listening, anybody researching their own military ancestors. So if anybody does have a question for Jen, please feel free to add it into the comments, and we'll do our best to get to as many as we possibly can before the end of the session. Yeah, do I have any more housekeeping, or is that it?
I think that's it.
You think that's it?
I think that's it.
Wonderful. So just before we start with the research then, Jen, I thought it would be a really nice point to stop and reflect as to why we mark something like Remembrance Day, and why it's such a poignant moment for people like ourselves, people who are family historians, and the role we have to play in that. I don't know if you have any particular thoughts.
Oh, I have a lot of thoughts. I should probably start by saying, like, I hope I can get through this hour without tearing up or actually crying, because the research that we do every year for Remembrance is so important. So why does remembrance matter so much is really the question. So obviously most people who watch us here, like, they know I'm American. So in America, this is Veterans Day versus Remembrance Day. It's a very different tone. So when I joined Find My Past originally, it took me a little while to figure out that Remembrance is significantly different, actually, than Veterans Day, or even the US version of Memorial Day, which we have in May. But once I kind of got to that point where I was like really understanding a bit better, without having lived it and experienced it, understanding a bit more about remembrance itself, I think it really hit home for me why this does matter so much. I mean, World War I is a topic that in the United States we don't really talk about very much. And of course, we entered the war significantly later. So when you start researching people from across Great Britain, Ireland, and the British Empire, the Commonwealth countries, it takes on a very different meaning. The history is quite different, and it really does take a minute to kind of sit and embrace that. And I think my perspective coming into Remembrance, not having grown up with it, not having had it as part of my culture, maybe for me, it's been more of an adult lesson of like, wow, this is incredibly significant because the numbers are so staggering, and, the statistics are so kind of mind blowing. I think for me, I take it it's very emotional for me. It's very intimate for me because it's something that I didn't just kind of go, oh, well, we put up the bunting and put on our poppies and go through the motions of remembrance. It's a very it started as an academic exercise, but like quickly converted to like a real sympathy and concern for the loss of life and the waste and studying the war, especially World War I as a whole, and understanding what each battle brought and didn't bring in terms of like military campaigns and like the sacrifice that these men all made and these families made to really only gain like a couple of yards, if that. That to me is incredibly powerful. Now, add on to that another layer that I do have quite a strong military legacy in my family. We've been in the United States for a long time, but on my paternal side, we have someone who's fought in every major engagement on behalf of what we now know as the United States of America since the French and Indian War in the 1600s. I have someone in every single engagement. And in most cases, my direct line came home. And I have, some collateral ancestors that didn't, of course. But I don't have that, like, kind of standard, typical experience of someone in the UK who can easily point to their family and say, great Uncle Bill didn't come home from the war. That's not my same experience, although I do have a huge respect for that long line of military involvement. And like, some of it was patriotic and some of it was, because of the draft or conscription. And some of it was really just because they cared passionately about their country and they wanted to defend it in whatever situation they found themselves. So it's kind of, for me, I guess, that combination of like the legacy of a descendant of military people, but also this kind of process of learning and embracing the history of World War I in particular and the impact that it had.
Just going back to what you said about it being emotional, you and I are quite similar beings in that sense. We feel things very, very deeply. We can empathize with other people's pain and emotions very, very well, probably too well, I would say.
Yeah.
And I've lost count of the amount of times over the past few months where I've messaged you or you've messaged me, and it's been like a find from some of this research that's been done, or just something in the newspapers or something in a war diary, and we've just had to take a moment to just process it because it is deeply, deeply emotional. And I remember you said to me the other day, as much as I enjoy this, Ellie, I'll be really glad when I can research something a little bit cheerier.
yeah. I mean, so, to kind of give perspective to people who are listening, I don't research Remembrance in November, right? In order for us to kind of tell the stories that we tell and pull everything together, I started researching Remembrance in July. So I have kind of been working on these men and their stories and this very, very close-up, intimate view of their lives and their experience for months. And there were definitely days during that process when I would read something, or I would read a battle account, or I would, look at the war diaries and realize that the person I had been working on, that's the day he died. And I would have to stop, not just for a minute. I would have to kind of stop for a couple of hours and like have a good cry. And like, I think as human beings, it's important for us to sympathize with each other and have that empathy for the generations that came before. I also think as family historians, to kind of go back to your original question, there is a little bit of responsibility there. I feel a responsibility for sure to tell these stories, to talk about these men who have paid this ultimate sacrifice. I'm not related to any of them, but they did something so remarkable. And we can talk, historians can talk about the big picture and the statistics and the numbers, but family historians look at history from a very individual, personalized view. And we talk about history not on a grand scale, but from a very micro scale. And that's the difference to me, right? That's the difference between me and just a historian, if you will, is that I talk about history all the time, every day. And I study history, but I study it from the perspective of a single individual's participation in that moment that we now refer to as history. And to me, that's incredibly powerful. And it allows, it opens the opportunity for these people to be remembered, right? Which is what it's all about.
Yeah. And, you said yourself that you can't point to somebody who served in the the British Armed Forces or the Commonwealth Armed Forces during World War I and World War II. Which, but what the research you do is amazing anyway, because you breathe life back into so many people's stories. For me, myself, around Remembrance Day, I remember people like my paternal grandfather, who I've spoken about quite a lot. He fought in the Second World War in the 8th Army. I've not really spoken about my granny on my maternal side, my granny's uncle, who was in the Navy, and he, I think his tugboat hit a mine in the Mediterranean in 1942, and he was missing, presumed dead, and obviously he never came home. But yeah, I suppose that's my question of the week for you all, actually, for anybody watching and listening. Who around Remembrance Day, who is at the front of your thoughts? Who are you taking a moment in that 2 minutes to remember? Whether it's a family member, whether it's a friend, whether it's an ancestor, or a veteran who you don't know personally at all, but their story really resonates with you. We would love to know. Liam, I know Liam's with us as well. Could you pop that question into the comments, just so everybody can refer back to it, please? So, like, who do you remember around Remembrance Day? That would be great. Thank you. And while you guys are all answering that, I think we should get into the sort of the meat of what we're going to be discussing today. At Findmypast this year, what we've been doing around Remembrance is all about this no story left behind, because there are going to be so many stories of not just people who serve, but also civilians affected by war. There are going to be so many stories that just get lost. They get half scattered, half remembered. And going back to what you said, Jen, I think it's incumbent upon us as people who are who love history and who are passionate about it, to make a little bit of a special effort and make sure that no story is left behind, I guess. So because of this, the work that you've done for this, Jen, has been varied and broad and emotive, and you've actually done so much. I can't even put into words. You've researched so many people, and I think we're just going to touch on one particular case study today and talk about your research methodology behind it. But before we do that, can we talk a little bit about the PALS battalions? Because I know this was so vital and important to your research, this concept of PALS battalions. So just in case anybody isn't familiar, what were they and why do you think they are so worthy of our attention?
Yeah, so the PALS battalions are very uniquely British, which makes it interesting right off the top, right? Like no other country had to do this in terms of recruitment. So the PALS battalions is essentially a recruitment drive started by a handful of people, but you think about the posters of Lord Kitchener with his mustache and "I need you." Those are the recruitment tools that they were using at the time. And initially, the recruitment and volunteer signups for the army when the war broke out was quite, there was a pretty big rush. And lots of patriotism and I'm going to go join the forces. And of course, that was the period when they were all saying, we'll be home by Christmas and all of that. But Lord Kitchener and others really recognized that the war was not going to be quick. It was not going to be short. And they needed men. At the time, the British Army had a very small kind of standing army and a territorial army. But the German forces and others had a system in place where, you were conscripted into the army at a young age and you were trained and you served X many number of years. And then you go back to civilian life. But if you got called up again, you already had the training, you knew what unit you were in, you had all the tools, right? You just had to kind of remember how it all worked, right? Britain didn't have that. So they created this campaign where they said, if you volunteer, you can join with your buddies from the same community. You can sign up with your brothers or the people from your workplace or your football team. Any group of men could kind of come in and enlist together, and they promised that they would serve together. So you would train together, you would be in the same unit together, you would go off to Europe or whatever whatever country or location you went to, you would do all of those things together. And of course, the detrimental part of that program, it worked really, really well. People did sign up in these large groups. But of course, if you fight together, you die together. So there is this reality of this recruitment drive where towns and villages at home were seeing the entire generation of the young men. They're literally everybody from a certain age in their male population being killed in a single day. And that trauma and that impact on a local community, but just like emotionally as well, was, of course, unimaginably devastating. So the PALS battalions were a very successful recruitment drive that on the battlefield turned into disaster.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of it, it almost sounds, it sounds lovely. It sounds, it's about
right.
Brotherhood and patriotism and
and
fighting alongside people you care about.
Right, exactly. And having you're stuck in the trenches and the conditions are horrible, but at least your cousin is there with you, right? At least your football mates are there with you. And so there's a sense of like, I can get through this because I'm with the people I love the most. But at the same time, if you go over the top and you're in the middle of the Battle of the Somme and everybody around you gets shot down and you're the last man standing, I don't know. There are no words really to understand how that moment feels, or what your brain does, or like, and I still question, like, is it fight or flight at that moment, right? Am I desperately trying to get back to the trenches because I literally just saw 17 people I know just get killed? Is it so traumatic that I just dropped to the ground and I'm frozen? Do I see that and get angry and try to take revenge and like throw myself at the enemy and probably end up, as a result of that emotional reaction, probably getting shot myself? Like, I don't have words. I don't know how to express it, because you try to put yourself in their position, right? And you try, and when you're researching these people, you try and think about what their life was like and what their experience was like and what they actually went through. But there's no way to, I don't think there's no way to really know what these men went through.
Again, the idea of being able to go to war, something that would have been quite daunting. I think the whole idea of I'm going to leave my home and I'm going to go
Absolutely.
somewhere I've never been before with people I've never been with. I imagine it would have been softened by the fact that you could go with people you knew. That made it less daunting, less scary.
Yeah.
And maybe the idea was that you would do a better job as a soldier and feel a little bit more like a unit. Like you didn't necessarily have to go off and train with men that you'd never met before. There was already those bonds were already in place. But on the flip side of that, in battle, when you start losing people, surely it must hurt that much more, because those bonds were already in place and these were already people that you knew. That's got to be quite tough. And you've already
the trauma is just unremarkable, right? Yeah.
You've already touched a little bit about the impact of like the local communities as well. But I suppose, like, just to reiterate that think about it, there's a small town's whole generation of young men, well, almost a whole generation, should we say, just gone, just like that, and possibly in one day.
Yeah, imagine opening the newspaper and maybe you're sitting at home and you got the telegraph and you understand that your soldier is now gone, but then opening the newspaper the next day and seeing that list of names, or the faces, their pictures were published often, and I there's some newspapers that did the entire front cover just full of pictures of people from their community that had been killed, and it's remarkable. It's startling. Gordon in the comments actually said that the idea of the PALs devastated the Newfoundland regiments in World War I. That's exactly right. And if you read any kind of summary or quick article or anything about the PALS battalions, you kind of learn really quickly just how devastating it really was. Yeah.
I don't know if anybody watching and listening has seen this yet, but we've actually taken some of these photographs from the newspapers of men who fell, and we've turned those into their own record set, which is now searchable. And I don't know if any of you have managed to have a play with it at all yet, but I'll just share the link in the comments. There's about 3,500, I think, at the moment, but we are planning on adding to this. This is just the beginning. And I
think that's sorry, Ellie, that's the important bit right there, is that this is something that is ongoing, because as we do more research and we discover more of these newspaper pages and these groupings of photographs, we add them to the collection. So it's a ever-growing resource.
Yeah, we must take a moment to thank our colleague Charlotte as well for doing a lot of the work on this. Thank you so much, Charlotte, if you're listening. So we've talked about the PALS battalions and what they were, the impact of them on local communities. And I think that leads us in nicely to why we've chosen to talk about one of your PALS case studies today, Jen. Because there were so many that you could have chosen from. We probably couldn't have covered more than one in this session. I think the one that you've chosen is particularly illustrative of everything that we've just discussed. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to hand over to you, Jen. I might interject a little bit, but I'll just let you talk about your case study. I'm hoping that for you guys listening, you might get a real glimpse into Jen's methodology, pick up some hints and tips for your own research, and we just hopefully will be able to illustrate that through this case study. So I think I'll pass to you, Jen, to talk about Tom Wiley.
Yeah, so Tom Wiley was a second lieutenant. He served in the 15th Service Battalion in the Prince of Wales' Own, the West Yorkshire Regiment, the 1st Leeds. Yeah, all the same unit, lots of different names for it. This is a Leeds PALS battalion. He dies on the 1st of July, 1916, the first day of the Somme. His story is average but remarkable at the same time, which I think is probably true for a lot of World War I soldiers that we work at. We could probably say that about a lot of different men, right? They're so average, but that's what makes them so special and worthy of talking about, right? Is that they're like, that's everybody's ancestor. His father's name was Arthur. He was an MP for Leeds. Before that, he was a solicitor. So Arthur has a pretty extensive amount of newspaper coverage from his career. His mother is a woman named Maud. She also has an extensive amount of newspaper coverage. He is remembered at one of the memorials in France. So he's one of the men that doesn't have a unique grave. He's just at the memorial. He has one brother, Gerald, who actually dies quite young. He dies in 1934. He's too young to serve in the war. But when I find the family initially, it was through one of those newspaper articles that I referenced. And of course, kind of the immediate reaction is identify the family structure, right? So I went to the 1911 census and found them fairly efficiently. The 1911 census is in and of itself striking because Tom is actually away at school during the period of the census. So go to his census record, right? Found the family first. And then find Tom's. But that led me to realize that we had material about him in our school records collection. So he's actually at Harrow. Anyway, at Harrow. And we have photographs from Harrow on Findmypast. So I was able to find Tom as this kind of very fresh-faced young man. I think in the picture he's 11 or 12 years old. So it's obviously 1911-ish, 1912, and he's this very youthful looking, but like hopeful, so iconically like representative of his social class and and the country as a whole, right? Pre-war, everybody was just like, we haven't been to war for a long time. We're focused on ourselves and like making our country better. And we're not engaged in all of the little European conflicts that are going on, because there were lots of conflicts happening in Europe, but Britain had taken a real active step back and said, yeah, we're not going to actually do that. We're not going to get involved in your arguments anymore. And so, Britain is kind of enjoying this whole period of real growth and development and invention and discovery, and the country's changing, right? The effects of the Industrial Revolution are still happening. And so here's Tom in the middle of all of this. Like, I'm a young man, I'm at school, I'm kind of living my best life. And it all of that kind of comes across in that single photograph. So that really struck me right at the beginning of the research process of like, so many people that we research are just kind of these faceless, you try to imagine what they might look like, or kind of how they're dressed, or any, their circumstances. But I didn't have to do that in this case. Anyway, I got distracted by the photograph. But so Tom's, yeah, like I was like, it was just such a tangent, right? And even in the research process like this, I kept going back to that school photograph. His full name is actually quite long and unique, which made him simultaneously easy and also difficult to find in the records. So his full name is Thomas Arthur Raymond Robert Ellicott Wiley.
That's a mouthful.
But because of that, it was easier to find him in military records because he has all of these abbreviated middle names. It was easier to find him on census records, and it was easier to find him in school records and all of that. And then, of course, because his father is an MP and a solicitor, like the family's kind of well known anyway, right? And certainly well off. So we've got this environment in which the family's kind of in this, they've got, they're in the upper middle to upper class. They have made a name for themselves in the community. His father is certainly well known. So you can kind of trace the family through newspapers, certainly through his father's activities. But then you add in his mom, which to me was a whole nother perspective of the research. And when you find them in the census and you find the military records and you say, who's the next of kin and all of those things, it's usually the mom. So I started looking at his mom, Maud. Turns out Maud is also the daughter of a soldier. Her father was stationed in India. So that's where she was born. And she ends up going to school in London. She is a vocalist. She gets discovered by this recruiter, essentially, and is basically told, if you go to London and you knock on this guy's door and tell him I sent you, you will end up on stage. So she does that. And she gets kind of a couple little roles, and she travels around. I think that's where she meets her future husband and eventually becomes the next prima donna at the Savoy Theatre. So she's in this production. She's already engaged to be married to Mr. Wiley. So she has like this one run at the Savoy, and then she disappears from celebrity life because she gets married and they go to Leeds and like start a family. So there's this whole context around Tom and his environment and his education and his background, where both the mom and the dad kind of incorporate their own personalities, right? So you imagine the household in 1911. It's a lawyer, politician, plus this, formerly famous, incredible performer, rave reviews about her performance. And then here's these two boys in the middle of that are being sent to really good schools. And, like the whole pre-war period is kind of just displayed in this household. So Tom eventually joins the Pals. He, unfortunately, of course, does lose his life on the first day of the Somme. When the news hits home, there is an immediate reaction from the parents. So Arthur, his father, actually commissions a stained glass window in the local parish church, which is built. It takes 3 years for it to be completed. They also pay for a new vault, a new family vault, which is directly across from the window inside. So the family will be together forever is kind of the sentiment that comes across in the paper. Quite tragically, his father, Arthur, and his grandfather also both die on the 1st of July, just like Tom. So the 1st of July has 3 deaths in it for this family across this period of just slightly less than a decade. And all 3 men die on the 1st of July. So the 1st of July becomes this day of just like real pain. And like, I mean, the legacy of that date, I'm sure, was felt for many, many years after these 3 deaths. So here we go into military experience, right? So we've got kind of this family background. We know all these things about the tragedy of this one death and the impact it made in this family. But then we need to look at some of the military history as well. So it's the Leeds Pals, the 15th Battalion of the West Yorkshire Regiment. They were raised and trained in Colsterdale, and I think I'm pronouncing that right. They deployed to Egypt in 1915, then they go to France in March of 1916 in preparation for the Somme. We can review most of their service records, their medal rolls, their war grave memorials. We have military service memorials and the gazetteers and like the newspaper content, of course, that we can refer to. The 1911 census kind of gives us this household structure. And then we fast forward to 1921, where we see the parents at home together. The younger son is now himself at school, different school. But the family is, again, kind of maintaining that tradition of, you know, sending your boys off and separating them, even though they've gone through the kind of this tragic loss, right? One of the more interesting things I think about some of the newspaper content is that the boys, Tom and his brother, they have this cousin who grows up and works for Barclays Bank. And he travels all over the place and he never gets married and he doesn't seem to have any children of his own. But every single year until this cousin passes away in the 1950s, he publishes an in memoriam notice in the Yorkshire Evening Post. Every single year on the 1st of July, Tom and then eventually his father and eventually his mother and then eventually his brother are all memorialized in the paper. And it doesn't matter. I mean, I traced this man on passenger lists and going to North America and India and the Caribbean, just all over the world. And it did not matter where he was. He published on the 1st of July in the Yorkshire Evening Post every single year.
I thought we said we weren't going to cry.
Well, no, we said we were going to try not to cry.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's so beautiful. And it just goes to show that this loss hit him very, very hard.
Yeah. The thing about it that kind of kills me, but is something that is useful for us as family historians, is that that's not actually that unique, right? Especially in PALS battalions. You would see in memoriam notices for my brother in arms that I served with in the first Leeds, and they were published year after year after year after year by other members of the PALS units or people that served underneath them, or, you know, that were their commanding officers, both directions. And then you also have these familial relationships, right? So this is a cousin who's leaving these memorials, but it could have very easily have been a parent or a brother or a grandchild or whatever.
Yeah.
So there's a lot in this story. And we haven't even really talked about the battle itself or, you know, his experience on the battlefield.
Well, I think we should carry on with that. Yes, I think in addition
you
to...
talk for a second so I can take a sip.
Okay. Yeah, there's, as you said, Jen, there's already an awful lot there. You've already touched on some of the resources that you've used. And we've basically built up a little bit of a picture here of Tom's life pre this big battle that would take his life. There's so much context that we can research and that we can think about, and it's like those extra layers that bring this man's story to life in a way that you can't normally do if you just view somebody's military record, or if you even if you know, oh, that, you know, this person died in the Battle of the Somme. Like, that's tragic enough. That's detail enough, but there is actually more you can do. And I think by going into his family and trying to picture what his family life would have been like with this sort of possibly serious politician father and possibly a fun-loving thespian mother. I mean, I'm paraphrasing, it's not the right word.
Speculating.
Yeah, speculating. Thank you. It's as I said, it's just adding those extra layers. Suddenly, this person is lifted off a page and becomes so a 3D person, as opposed to somebody who's 2D and whose name is just on a piece of paper.
Yeah, we talk a lot about delving deeper into their story. We use those words really intentionally, right? Delving deeper is really important, but what actually does that mean? And I think it means everything that you just summarized, right? It's the genealogical records that we can access, but it's also the contextual information. It's looking at things on a map and understanding how close was that parish where they built the window. How close was that to the actual residence? It turns out it's like a block and a half away. So you can almost picture mom and dad kind of walking down to the church and seeing the progress on the window, or just walking down the street and literally just standing and looking at the window and reflecting on the loss. It does mean that you're looking at military history and war diaries and trying to understand not just, oh, it's the first day of the Battle of Somme, which we all probably know at least a little bit about, but actually going into what did his unit do that day, not just what did the British Expeditionary Force do on the 1st of July, 1916, but where was he in that lineup? So it turns out he's the Leeds Pals is part of the 31st Division, and they are lined up to attack the village of Sierre, which I think I'm saying right. They, of course, just like most of the men in the trenches that morning, at 7:30, the whistles blow, and that's the sign to go up over the top into no man's land. And the idea was that there had been a bombardment for 2 weeks prior to that day. And that bombardment was intended to tear down and destroy all the barbed wire and the fencing and all the defense mechanisms that the German forces had put up, but it didn't. It was actually unsuccessful in doing that. So here's these men who have been told it's a clear path for you from trench to German trench. Like no man's land is just a sprint. That's all you have to do is just get across it, and you will be able to take down the German forces. At the same time, the bombardment is continuing, but on a timetable, right? So they didn't obviously have any kind of instantaneous two-way communication from battlefield to the gunners in the back, which are roughly 200 yards or so back behind the line. So the gunners had a schedule, like every so many minutes, move your guns and go 5 more yards forward, 5 more yards forward. But the men in no man's land aren't able to keep up with that bombardment because they can't get through the barbed wire because it was never taken down in the first place. So here are these men kind of underneath the shelling, right? Because things are still flying over their heads and going off. The Germans see them coming right away. They start, counteroffensive attacks, right, with their machine guns and through their pillboxes, and the men can't get through their wire. So they are running across a field that's full of holes and craters. It's a moonscape, I think is the word that's typically used, because it had been a battlefield before. So it's been attacked by shells for a couple of years at this point. They don't get very far, right? The Leeds Pals only probably get less than 50 yards across this 200-yard span that they're supposed to be able to cover in really no time at all. So now they're stuck. So you get to the point where, let's say you get injured and you end up in one of those shell holes. Well, now what do you do? Because you're sitting down in this crater, you're protected, kind of, but you're still out in no man's land, and anything could kind of come across you at that point. And they do suffer real heavy casualties, right? So they lose about 24 officers and 504 other ranks that are either killed, wounded, or missing. It's about they went over the top with about 900 men. So out of 900, they lose 530. And that all happens within an hour, basically, right? So Tom's in D Company as a second lieutenant. He would have been leading from near the front somewhere, kind of literally physically leading his men into no man's land, facing this awful terrain, the counterfire, but as the shelling going over his head at the same time from your own forces. The family background, of course, adds this, really interesting dimension, because he would have been someone who probably was taking great pride in the fact that he was an officer and serving in the army. And there's a whole sense of like, the British stiff upper lip and like being a member of the British Army. And this is, these are not trained military professionals. These are not people as part of the standing army. So there's a sense of like, I have to prove myself because I'm just as good of a soldier as any other guy, even though I volunteered and I haven't been training for the last 10 years of my life, right? I can still be the British Army soldier. And there was this point of pride for these men, especially in the PALS battalions, of showing that I am here and I'm going to fight just like any other member of the standing army. So there's all these kind of social and class implications going on. And I mean, you can just imagine, the night before, when they're laying in their trench, kind of thinking about the fact that they're going into battle tomorrow, what are they thinking about? Are they just taking deep breaths and going, all right, hey, we got a job to do tomorrow? Or are they going, I need to make my father proud. I need to make my country proud. I need to make sure my men get out safely. Like there's so many different aspects to this. I think the landscape is something that maybe up until this year I hadn't really thought about, right? So you get to midday or the end of the day on the first day of the Somme, and it's, again, kind of hard to even imagine, but there are bodies everywhere. It's not a battlefield, it's a graveyard, but everybody's on the surface. And even if you're not deceased yet, if you're injured, there's no way, in most cases, there's no way to get to you. So you're laying in one of these craters, you're injured, you're crawling maybe from place to place, trying to get back, trying to get to a medic. Medics can't get to you. There's snipers, right? German snipers are on the field somewhere. If you pop your head up out of one of those holes, that might be it. But at the same time, if you don't, this is definitely it, because you're going to bleed out. Like the pressure of that field of battle that day must have just been, I don't know, I'm not even finishing sentences at this point, Ellie, but it would have been so intense. How do you describe that? I don't know how to describe that.
I don't know either. But Jen, myself, and our colleague Daisy, to mark Remembrance Day, we each wrote a blog, which was available on the Findmypast website, about a different PALS battalion. And for these, we looked at war diaries for these particular battalions. And I had a look at the Grimsby one, and because I helped Daisy with hers a bit, I also looked at the Bradford one. And it just goes back to what you said, Jen, about, over half these men not returning. I'm about to sneeze, so I apologize. It also talks about how, in quite clinical detail, but it's also quite stark, I would say, because obviously these are regiment diaries. These are not meant to be, long, overly detailed.
Yeah,
things.
they're very business, right? They're
exactly.
Yeah.
But even though they are very business-like, you still get that sense of, we can hear our men out there calling for help and we can't get to them.
Yeah.
You can still get the sense of, Lieutenant Hendon made it to this crater, and that's probably as far as they got, and that sort of thing. And the fact that the trenches are in a really, really bad state today, and no man's land is just filled with bodies. Like, even from that very business-like regiment diary, you still get that. And they were really hard to read, actually. I think I sent you.
They're really hard to read. Yeah.
Little snippets, and I was just like, I cannot believe what I'm reading. For anybody curious, if you want to go and have a look at any particular battalion's war diary, you can do that for free with the National Archives. You just go to their catalogue, you find the one you want. If you sign into an account, a free account, you can actually download it for free. And it comes with each one normally comes with a few different PDF documents, and all you and I did, I think, was go straight up to 1916, find July, and just read
find
on.
the date.
But there's so much more you can read, and there's maps and things like that as well, which are quite interesting.
The other bit I would tell people, especially if you're not as comfortable with the National Archives catalog, their discovery system, you can just Google it. You can just say War Diary, whatever, 15th Battalion, Leeds Regiment, and it one of the search results will likely be, one of the top search results will likely be the War Diary on the TNA website. So you can go directly in via a Google search, which, even though I use the TNA Discovery Catalog all the time, I still often go to Google first because it's usually a little faster.
Yeah. So where do we go from there then?
I think, the family, so Tom's story basically kind of is captured in what we've already talked about. So he is injured and ultimately dies on that first day. The Leeds pals suffer, all those heavy casualties like we've talked about. He is memorialized on the war memorial inside the Minster Church of St. Peter in Leeds. So that's the parish that we've been talking about. And we actually have pictures of that on Findmypast as well through one of our newer record collections. I remember the Military Service Memorial Collection actually has a number of photographs of that particular memorial, as well as others across the country. So you can actually see the memorial without having to travel. We actually even got to the point where I had a couple of colleagues at Findmypast who live near there actually went and tried to go to the parish. It is no longer open and it's a little bit overgrown and kind of some fences and stuff. So they couldn't get to it, but it looked like the window was still actually there. It might've been boarded up, but we kind of saw suspiciously what looked like would have been Tom's window. When Arthur dies, what's interesting to me about this story is that it just never stops, actually. So when Arthur dies, obviously he's this famous MP, right? Really well known in the community. So his funeral service gets a lot of newspaper coverage as well. And in that newspaper content, they relive Tom's death over and over and over again. So there's several articles about his funeral with pictures and the whole bit, but in every single one, they go back to, isn't it tragic that he died on the same day as his son at the Battle of Somme? And they tell Tom's story repeatedly. And then when his wife dies, when Maud dies, the same thing. They talk about Arthur's death and Tom's death. And then of course you have that cousin, his name is Charteris, who just keeps talking. So Tom's legacy really is alive in the newspapers from 1916, the day he dies, all the way through the 1950s. And then it just stops cold. So from a research perspective, you kind of go, okay, well, something happened, right? And that's obviously when Charteris, the cousin, passes away and there's no one left to do that. But that's the point where you kind of go, this is a story that is no longer being remembered. And so for me, I think as a family historian, right, I think, and I kind of said this earlier, I feel it as a bit of a responsibility. But to me, that means I need to make sure that my online tree on the Findmypast website is really well researched. And I have a lot of citations, I have all my evidence. I upload images of the war diaries and everything that I found to make sure that if a descendant stumbles across that tree someday, they have access to everything that I have access to, right? There's no reason why I can't share that research in a way that is long lasting and preserved and discoverable, right? Because anybody now who goes on to Findmypast and finds the tree that I've built for Tom Wiley will find all of those newspaper clippings and everything else that we've discovered through this process. And to me, that's an important step, right? Because again, I'm not related to any of these people that I research. I didn't have anybody in Britain after like 1840. Like that's my last ancestor that comes over to America. So anybody from this period is someone that I want to make sure that I leave enough breadcrumbs and I leave enough evidence that it's meaningful to the next person who stumbles across it.
Well, that was going to be exactly the word I used, was meaningful. It's contributing to his legacy, but not just his legacy, it's also the family legacy. Because what you said about the fact that he doesn't just seem to exist in isolation, Tom. He's he exists in the narrative of his father, of his mother, of his cousin, of his brother, and of his the people he served with. And sometimes I always bring it back to fan research, because I think it's one of the most important, for me, most important methods of research that you can do. You don't just research one person in isolation. You research around them, and by doing that, you add so much more color to that story. And my dog has just finished his.
I was just going to say, your dog is ready, isn't he?
He's about to make an appearance, so I apologize for that. But we are coming close to the end of the hour now. But I thought it might be nice to just perhaps take a few questions, if anybody has any, maybe about the story or about Jen's research process, anything like that. But in the meantime, if anybody would like to submit one, I thought we could have a look through your question of the week answers as to who you remember around this time of year. So Gina remembers her father, who served in the RAMC, was one of the services that liberated Bergen-Belsen. That would have been pretty horrific, I think. I recently rewatched episode 9 of Band of Brothers, and that is additionally a very hard watch. I imagine the documentary was worse. I imagine actually being there would have been pretty awful. So we remember him as well, Gina. Thank you for submitting that. Sarah would like to remember Private John Duff of the Gordon Highlanders, who was killed in action on the 6th of November 1916. He was 29 years old. We remember him as well. Sorry, I'm definitely losing my voice.
That's okay. I'll pick up the next one.
Thank you.
Daphne remembers her father and grandfather served in World War I and World War II. They both lived into their 60s, but certainly brought home a lot of trauma. After all they went through and how it affected them, ultimately died from their wounds. I think, Daphne, you raise a really good point. We haven't talked about the mental or emotional trauma that these men underwent. What they referred to, of course, is shell shock during World War I, what we would probably call PTSD, in most cases, post-traumatic stress disorder. Well worth understanding if you are researching anybody in either war, especially World War I. Lynn wants to add her paternal great-grandfather with the Northumberland Fusiliers, World War I. Thank you, Lynn. These are hard to read, you guys. Alan's grandfather in the 14th Battalion of the Royal Fusiliers during World War II, involved with the England invasion of Iceland, which I don't know anything about, which I am now going to have to read about. Alan, thank you for acknowledging that and remembering your grandfather with us today. I'm going to do one more.
If you want.
Yeah. Thank you, because I'm going to cry.
Yeah, I want to go and look that up as well, actually. Lynn remembers a maternal grandfather who was with the SARs, with the Canadian Expeditionary Forces. He came home but died in 1954 from medical issues from the Second World War. And his brother died at the Battle of Caen as well. Yeah, we remember them too. Thank you for that. Helen says, I remember my grandfather. He was in the Manchester Pals. Served on the Somme, was gassed, shot and captured, and spent the rest of the war as a prisoner doing forced labour. And died prematurely from lung damage, probably sustained by the fact that he was gassed.
In the mine.
Yeah. Gordon remembers his grandfather in the army, World War I, but survived. And his father, who was served in the Navy in the Second World War, who survived but would never speak about it. A lot of veterans don't and didn't, and I don't really think I'm surprised by that. I'll take one more. Simon remembers his grandfather's brother James Smith, who died at Passchendaele and has no known grave. Actually, speaking of the Somme and of Passchendaele, I don't know whether any of you know, but Jen was recently a guest on 2 History Hit podcasts that talk about the Somme and Passchendaele. So if you are interested in that, I'll find a link afterwards if any of you would like to go and have a listen.
I think anybody learning about Passchendaele has to come with a warning label. This is the first year I've researched Passchendaele, and that was hard.
Yeah. That's how many more have we got here? 2 more to do. Matthew remembers his grandmother's cousin, John William Gray, born in Kentish Town in London, served with the 1st Battalion London Regiment and died in October 1916 and aged just 20 years old. And this is particularly important, I think, because Matthew said that he only found out about John by doing his family tree, by researching his family tree, because John had no children, never married. So unless Matthew had gone, if he hadn't gone and done this research, then sorry, that is my dog.
Yeah, Vinny is having a good time back there.
Yes. Unless if Matthew hadn't done this research, then John's memory might have been forgotten. So thank you so much, Matthew. You have made sure that his story was not left behind. Thank you. And just last one here, Karen remembers her great-grandfather who served in the First World War in the Queen's London Regiment and sadly took his own life in 1928. Again, I don't think that was I don't think that sort of thing was particularly uncommon either. Very, very sadly.
It's not actually. I've spent some time specifically looking into suicide after the war, and there's no statistics. There's no list anywhere, right? You find death certificates and you find mentions in newspapers, but of course, in most cases, they're very judgmental, right? Because in the period, suicide wasn't just a crime; it was anti everything that Britain kind of stood up for at that point. Like it was so socially incorrect, and the newspaper articles are really fascinating. Again, very difficult to read, but really fascinating to read through because they will often say things like, at the inquest around the death, there will be some witness saying, "Well, he didn't come home with any injuries. He was never hit in the head. I don't understand how the war caused this to happen," because they have no concept of mental health yet, right? They don't understand that the mental and emotional impact was just as powerful as the physical. So they would come home with no physical outward injury. And of course, everybody around them would go, "Well, they're fine. They came home from the war." But of course, they weren't fine. So it's, Karen, thank you for sharing that particular moment and his story and the tragedy of that, because those are the things that maybe we don't like to research very much, that maybe we don't like to face in reality, but obviously is still a problem that our society deals with today. And so how to veterans need to be taken care of, just like, and yeah, I'll try to get off my soapbox, Ellie. I'm sorry, but this is definitely something that has occurred to me and has hit me in a number of different ways. I was actually doing some work with a course a couple of years ago, and one of the topics that we talked about was the mental health of veterans after the war. And one of the people in the course was a veteran himself and had served with the U.S. Army. And his ability to speak to how veterans today are treated versus how they were treated after World War I is actually not that different. And so we're still not doing a great job taking care of our veterans, in my opinion.
No. Just before we finish, I thought it might be worth mentioning that one of the reasons that we focused on PALS battalions this November was because there's no single resource that lists every single PAL. So it's even more incumbent upon all of us, I think, to try and bring their stories back together and to make sure that they're researched and remembered and things like that. I think I shared a link in the chat earlier, which is our sort of PALS page, if anybody wants to go and have a look at that. There's also a section if you have a story about a PAL and you would like to share it, to sort of add to our growing archives, probably not the right word, but is a resource, I suppose.
Resource, yeah.
Please feel free to do so, because PALs can be quite tricky to research. They're not impossible, but they can be a little
but it's one of those things that if you don't know that the PALS battalions existed, you would never know. Like if you look at a military record, there's nothing that says PALS battalion on it in big bold letters. If you know about the PALS battalions and you find a military record, you have to go dig it out. You have to do enough research or reading or Google or whatever to actually go, oh, this was a PALS battalion. Oh, okay. Now I can put the dots together and like go further on the research in that regard. So the effort that we are kind of trying to undertake at Findmypast and with the community's help in a big way is actually putting those two things together in a much easier way, so that when someone does look up an ancestor and they find that military record, they can go, there's a notation there that says this was a PALS battalion and this is a thread that you need to pull on to understand this person's military experience. So that's kind of the ultimate goal, because as Ellie said, there is no kind of national list of this man served in this unit and it was a PALS battalion. Like that doesn't exist. There's a lot of great histories written about individual PALS battalions, but there's not a lot on just the whole program and the concept. And, there's some really good like Wikipedia articles and blog posts and things, but there's not a lot of academic work that's gone into kind of the whole PALS as a big topic versus, the Leeds PALS or the Grimsby Chums.
Yeah. I think that brings us nicely to a close, actually, Jen. As I mentioned, the dog is coming on the desk now.
Oh boy, Vinny.
Yes, this is Vinny, who you probably can't see at the moment, but he's currently standing on my desk. This was just one of the stories that Jen researched for Remembrance this year. If you follow that link, that PALS link that I put in the chat, there's more there for you to delve into. You can click through to the PALS blogs that we've done as well. There's even more stories in there. There's even more detail. There's even more tips. And just to reiterate what Jen said, like, thank you so much to everybody who has tuned in today. If you've shared a story of the person you've remembered, thank you also. It's sometimes hard to talk about these things, but it's important we remember these people, and we can do that collectively as well. Which I think is really important. Jen, do you have any closing thoughts at all?
I think you said that pretty nicely, but I would just encourage people to think about remembrance in a broad scale. Yes, it's important that we remember the people from our own families, but they had brothers in arms that they served with that didn't come home, and they deserve to be remembered too.
Yes, and Vinny the Vizsla feels very passionate about that as well. Thank you so much for joining us, everybody. We hope you have enjoyed it. We hope you've learned something. And I think that's it. I hope you all have a lovely, restful, peaceful weekend, and we will see you next time. Thank you so much. Bye.